There is something deeply misunderstood about ancient Egypt. We imagine pyramids, pharaohs, and mummies wrapped in gold. But the real mystery of Egypt isn't what they built, it's how they stayed alive. Because for thousands of years, ancient Egyptians made a choice that sounds absurd by modern standards. They drank beer every single day, not just adults, children, laborers, priests, entire households. Beer wasn't a celebration drink, it wasn't a vice, it was a staple. At the height of pyramid construction, workers were rationed up to 4 liters of beer per day. That wasn't excess, that was survival. And despite what we're taught, this didn't create a society of drunk laborers. Egypt remained stable, productive, and remarkably healthy for its time, lasting over 3,000 years. So why beer? Because in the ancient world, water was not neutral, it was dangerous. The Nile sustained Egypt, but it also carried disease. Floodwaters mixed human waste, animal remains, and decaying plants into every accessible water source. There was no filtration, no treatment, no understanding of bacteria. Drinking straight from the river or shallow wells was a gamble, and people paid for it with illness and death. The Egyptians didn't know why water made people sick, but they noticed patterns. Communities that relied heavily on raw water suffered more disease. Workers who drank beer stayed functional. Children raised on diluted beer survived at higher rates. This wasn't superstition, it was an observation. Beer became the default because it worked. The brewing process made it safer than water, more stable in extreme heat, and reliable in a landscape where clean hydration could mean the difference between life and collapse. Beer wasn't a luxury, it was technology. And once you understand what Egyptian beer really was, you realize this wasn't reckless behavior. It was one of the smartest public health decisions in human history. To understand why beer became essential in ancient Egypt, you first have to strip away modern assumptions about water. Today, water is clean, regulated, and treated before it ever reaches your glass. In the ancient world, it was anything but. The Nile was Egypt's lifeline, but it was also its greatest biological risk. Every year, the river flooded, spreading fertile silt across the land. That same floodwater also carried animal waste, decomposing plants, parasites, and human sewage straight into drinking sources. Wells were shallow and easily contaminated. Stored water quickly stagnated under the desert sun. There was no boiling, no filtration, no chemical treatment. Drinking raw water wasn't refreshing, it was exposure. Waterborne diseases like dysentery and intestinal parasites were common killers in pre-industrial societies. Even mild infections could become fatal in a climate where dehydration and heat exhaustion were constant threats. A single bad water source could cripple a village or halt an entire workforce. The Egyptians didn't understand microbes, but they understood the consequences. They watched who got sick and who didn't. Over generations, patterns became impossible to ignore. People who drank untreated water fell ill more often. People who drank beer did not. This wasn't a coincidence. It was biology working in their favor. The fermentation process behind beer created an environment hostile to harmful bacteria. Mild acidity, active yeast, and alcohol, even at low levels, dramatically reduced pathogen survival. Beer spoiled far more slowly than water and could be stored safely in sealed jars. In a desert civilization dependent on massive labor projects, this mattered. Safe hydration wasn't optional, it was infrastructure. So when Egyptians chose beer over water, they weren't indulging. They were minimizing risk. In a world without modern sanitation, beer wasn't reckless. It was the safest drink available. When we hear the word beer, we picture something cold, clear, and recreational. Ancient Egyptian beer was none of that. In fact, calling it beer at all is misleading. What Egyptians drank every day was closer to liquid bread than a modern alcoholic beverage. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and unfiltered. It was brewed from emmer wheat and barley, the same grains used to make bread. Bakers partially baked loaves, then crumbled them into water and allowed the mixture to ferment naturally. The result was a nutrient-dense drink filled with suspended grain, yeast, and fiber. This wasn't accidental, it was functional. Unlike modern beer, which is filtered to remove solids, Egyptian beer kept everything in. That meant calories, protein, B vitamins produced by yeast during fermentation, minerals like magnesium and potassium, fiber that slowed digestion and stabilized energy. For people working under the Egyptian sun, this mattered more than intoxication. The alcohol content was low, usually between 2 and 4%, enough to suppress harmful bacteria, not enough to impair labor. People didn't drink beer to get drunk, they drank it to eat. In many cases, beer replaced meals entirely. It provided hydration and nutrition in one container. Children drank diluted versions. Laborers drank stronger ones. Even priests and elites consumed specialized varieties during rituals and festivals. This is why beer appears everywhere in Egyptian life. Tomb paintings show brewing scenes. Administrative records list beer rations alongside bread. Medical texts describe beer as a base for remedies. Beer wasn't a side product of Egyptian society, it was woven into its metabolism. Once you understand what Egyptian beer actually was, the idea stops sounding primitive. It starts sounding efficient. In a world without refrigeration, sanitation, or modern medicine, liquid grain fermented into a safe, nourishing drink wasn't indulgence. It was engineering. The pyramids were not built on brute force alone. They were built on logistics, and at the center of that system was beer. Archaeological evidence shows that pyramid workers were not slaves but organized, paid laborers. Their wages weren't coins or gold. They were rations, bread, vegetables, and beer. In many cases, beer was the most valuable part of the payment. Records from work camps near Giza list daily beer allowances measured carefully by volume. This wasn't casual consumption, it was planned fuel. Beer provided calories, hydration, and micronutrients in a form that could be produced at scale and distributed reliably. In a desert environment, this solved a critical problem. Supplying clean water to tens of thousands of workers would have been nearly impossible. Beer, on the other hand, could be brewed near the Nile, stored in sealed jars, and transported without spoiling quickly. It didn't carry the same disease risk as raw water, and it didn't require constant access to fresh sources. Beer also stabilized labor. Workers who drank beer didn't suffer sudden energy crashes. The slow-digesting carbohydrates and nutrients released energy steadily, allowing long workdays under extreme heat. This made large, coordinated construction projects possible year after year. Temples and state-run breweries controlled production, turning beer into a centralized resource. This allowed authorities to regulate supply, reward productivity, and maintain order. In effect, beer functioned as both nourishment and administration. Without beer, pyramid construction would have faced constant interruptions from illness, dehydration, and fatigue. With it, Egypt sustained massive labor forces for decades. The pyramids weren't just monuments of stone, they were monuments to planning. And beer was one of the quiet systems that made the routine impossible. It wasn't a luxury, it was infrastructure in liquid form. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just food and drink, it was medicine. Surviving medical papyri show beer appearing again and again, in treatments for everything from digestive problems to wound care. It was mixed with herbs, minerals, and plant extracts. It was used as a carrier for drugs. It was consumed by the sick, the injured, and those recovering from illness. This wasn't a ritual, it was practical. Beer was safer than water, especially for people whose bodies were already weakened. Fermentation reduced harmful bacteria, and the mild alcohol content helped prevent further contamination. When an Egyptian doctor recommended beer, they were choosing the least risky option available. Beer also made nutrients easier to absorb. The fermentation process partially broke down grains, releasing vitamins and minerals that would otherwise pass through the body unused. B vitamins produced by yeast supported energy and nerve function. Minerals like magnesium and phosphorus helped with muscle recovery and bone health. For people suffering from injury or disease, solid food could be difficult to digest. Beer solved that problem. It delivered calories and nutrients in liquid form, reducing strain on the digestive system while still providing energy. Even external treatments involved beer. Wounds were sometimes cleaned with it, not because Egyptians understood sterilization, but because they observed lower infection rates compared to untreated water. Beer didn't eliminate pathogens completely, but it reduced risk enough to matter. What looks like superstition today was actually early empirical medicine. Egyptian healers relied on observation, repetition, and results. If something reduced illness and improved recovery, it stayed in practice. Beer earned its place because it worked. It wasn't sacred magic. It was functional medicine in a world without antibiotics. And in a civilization that valued stability above all else, anything that kept people alive and working became indispensable. The success of beer in ancient Egypt wasn't luck. It was fermentation doing exactly what biology allows it to do. When grain is mixed with water and left to ferment, microorganisms immediately go to work. Beneficial yeast and bacteria begin consuming sugars, producing mild alcohol and organic acids. This process creates an environment where harmful pathogens struggle to survive. In practical terms, fermentation turns a dangerous liquid into a safer one. Egyptians didn't know the word microbe, but they understood results. Beer didn't cause the same illnesses as raw water. It lasted longer in storage. It remained drinkable in extreme heat. Over generations, that knowledge became tradition. Fermentation also transformed nutrition. It broke down complex carbohydrates into more digestible forms. It reduced compounds that block mineral absorption. It increased the availability of B vitamins naturally produced by yeast. What entered the body required less work to extract energy from. That mattered in a climate where calories were precious and physical labor was constant. Beer delivered slow, steady energy rather than spikes and crashes. Workers could perform long hours without collapsing from exhaustion. There was also consistency. Brewing followed repeatable steps. Once perfected, the process produced predictable results. Safe hydration, reliable nourishment, scalable production. These are not small achievements for an ancient society. In effect, beer functioned as a biological filter. Instead of removing contaminants mechanically, it allowed beneficial organisms to outcompete harmful ones. The Egyptians didn't purify water, they transformed it. This is why beer worked when water failed. It aligned with natural processes instead of fighting them. What looks primitive through a modern lens was actually elegant. Fermentation solved multiple problems at once, using nothing more than grain, time, and observation. Beer wasn't a coincidence. It was applied biology, refined through centuries of survival. Today, the idea of drinking beer instead of water seems absurd. We imagine ancient Egyptians as primitive, relying on superstition rather than reason. But that perspective misses the point entirely. In reality, they were pragmatic, adaptive, and astonishingly effective. Modern humans forget just how hostile the environment was. Clean water didn't exist. The Nile, while life-giving, was also disease-laden. Storage systems were rudimentary. Heat and contamination made ordinary water a constant threat. In this context, beer wasn't indulgence. It was logic. We've outsourced our survival to infrastructure, pipes, purification systems, and regulated sanitation. We assume water is safe because we've made it safe. But take away those systems, and beer again becomes the sensible choice. The Egyptians understood this instinctively. They observed, experimented, and perfected a solution that worked for everyone, young, old, laborer, or priest. What's remarkable is that their system addressed more than hydration. Beer provided calories, essential nutrients, and safe liquid for daily consumption. It functioned as medicine, as wage, and as sustenance in one. It was infrastructure, nutrition, and public health combined, and it worked for thousands of years. The lesson isn't that we should start drinking beer all day. It's that ancient solutions were not primitive mistakes. They were the product of careful observation, trial and error, and an understanding of natural processes. Fermentation, in the hands of the Egyptians, became a tool for survival in ways modern societies take for granted. By dismissing beer as a quirky historical footnote, we forget the ingenuity it represents. Civilization thrived not because water magically existed, but because humans engineered alternatives when the natural system was hostile. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't foolish, it was smart, it was adaptive, and in a world without sanitation or refrigeration, it was one of the most sophisticated technologies imaginable. The Egyptians didn't fail to innovate, they simply solved problems we take for granted today. The story of Egyptian beer isn't about alcohol, it's about human ingenuity, adaptation, and survival. Modern readers often dismiss it as quirky or primitive, but that misses the deeper lesson. Ancient societies solved complex problems with the tools available, and their solutions were often smarter than we give them credit for. Beer provided more than hydration. It delivered calories, nutrients, and safe liquid in a way that water could not. It was a public health tool, sustaining entire populations in a hot, challenging environment where disease ran rampant. It was infrastructure disguised as drink, a carefully engineered system that ensured workers, children, and elders survived, thrived, and contributed to one of history's most remarkable civilizations. What makes this even more impressive is that the Egyptians accomplished all of this without modern science. They didn't know about bacteria, germs, or enzymes. They relied on observation, experience, and trial and error. And over centuries, they perfected a system that kept millions alive, healthy, and productive. The lesson extends beyond ancient history. Modern society often assumes that technology or chemicals are the only solutions to problems. But sometimes simplicity, working with natural processes rather than against them, can produce the most effective results. Fermentation is a prime example. It's a natural process. Yet the Egyptians harnessed it to create safety, nutrition, and reliability in a single step. We forget that ancient practices weren't random. They were adaptive strategies, often developed over generations and tested in real-world conditions. In a sense, the wisdom of Egyptian beer is timeless. Survival is less about what you drink and more about understanding the system you live in and engineering solutions that actually work. Egyptian beer teaches us to respect observation, patience, and practical innovation. Civilization wasn't just built on stone and labor, it was built on knowledge applied wisely, and sometimes that knowledge came in a cup. When we look back at ancient Egypt, we often focus on pyramids, pharaohs, and temples, but the quiet genius that made the civilization possible is hidden in plain sight: beer. What might seem like a casual beverage to modern eyes was, in reality, one of the most important technologies of the ancient world. Egyptian beer wasn't brewed for pleasure. It was brewed for survival. It was safe, reliable, and packed with nutrition. For laborers hauling massive stones under the desert sun, beer provided calories and hydration in a form that water alone could not. For children, it was a source of nourishment that was safer than the contaminated Nile. For the elderly and the sick, it was easily digestible sustenance. Beer's fermentation process killed harmful pathogens, made minerals more bioavailable, and stabilized energy. Beyond nutrition, beer functioned as infrastructure. It was distributed in rations, controlled by temples and state institutions, and even used as wages. A civilization that could organize massive construction projects, sustain armies, and manage agricultural production relied on beer as a critical tool. It reduced disease, maintained labor efficiency, and kept entire communities healthy. Modern society forgets this because our survival systems are hidden. Clean water, refrigeration, and industrial food production make us forget how delicate life once was. But in a world without those conveniences, beer was a solution honed over generations, a combination of observation, experimentation, and practical science. Egyptian beer wasn't a luxury, it wasn't indulgence, it was civilization distilled into liquid form. The pyramids, the temples, and the society that built them depended on it. When we dismiss ancient beer as quirky or primitive, we ignore the intelligence behind it. We forget that humans have always solved problems creatively with what they had. Ancient Egyptian beer worked. It sustained millions. It shaped one of history's greatest civilizations. Beer wasn't a vice. It was technology. It was knowledge. It was civilization in a cup.